Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to another HCS Debrief. This time, the FaZe Atlanta HCS Major Recap Edition. Bravo alongside Onset. Mark, good to be with you here, finally breaking this one down.
It's good to be back. It feels like the event was one to remember for a number of reasons that we'll get into. Yeah, we've obviously been very busy, but it's good to be back talking some Halo, and it's good to be able to kind of take a bit of time to reflect on the Atlanta Major, because there was some big stories coming out of it.
There really were. It's also an exciting time because it's wild to think that it was only about 2 weeks ago, yet we still also have Salt Lake in just about 2 weeks. So a very, very busy summer for the Halo Championship Series, but it was also one of my favorite events in quite some time. And you know, after next year will be 20 years of events for me. So it's not very often.
God.
It is,
20
yeah.
years.
20
Wow.
years, man.
Do you know what date?
It would be essentially I started going in the 05 season. I'd have to find the day, but
Oh, well, we're gonna have to get you a cake or something at the next event.
Thank you, man. Yeah, I'm excited. But it's wild to say. The reason I bring that up though is it's very rare these days after this many events that I come away from one and I say it was one of my favorites in a long time. Thought it was an amazing event in so many ways. I would say, yeah, maybe we start off with kind of just, general thoughts of everything. I would say for me, the venue was spectacular. I think the way that the seating was done, to be in an arena, also to have all of the partner and sponsor booths facing the main stage, and then having all the open pit right there as well. It felt just like a very, I don't know, I think you said it on the pre-show, but there was an old school vibe to it that felt really good.
Yeah, I agree. I think if I could choose where majors would take place, that kind of size of arena, I think, is really good for Halo. I think the seating is awesome as well. Like, obviously, I'm sure there's things that can be improved on, as there are with all events, right? But that one for me, it just felt like, this is what we should be doing. Like, this is really, really cool. This is where the fans can see. This is where we have the wall of noise. Everything is accessible. So, shout out to FaZe for the event, putting it together. Certainly for me, I think it's a blueprint for other orgs moving forward.
I really do too. Yeah, really. We got to chat to a lot of the people at FaZe and kind of all the hard work and investment that went into the event, and I think it really showed. And I think there was just an overall, just a great vibe. And then, that takes us kind of into, of course, deep into the matches. And we'll start off, as we do in the debrief, with one big takeaway. It's lunchtime here in London, so I'm kind of hungry, but we'll stick with tournament takeaways. I'll let you kick us off.
Okay, my one big takeaway that stands out for me from the event was SSG's bounce back and their unbeaten run. It was, we'll get into it a little bit more later in the show. Just a reminder to everyone, this isn't a podcast as well. But what a run. Like, what a bounce back. If there was ever any questions about were SSG, what was that first event of the season an SSG fluke, where we're going to see them reach those heights again, I think we got it answered. And for me, it was like, wow, like now they've won 2 out of 3 events, and it's looking like an SSG world that we're living in.
Yeah, I think what's even scarier too is talking to Elamite after the event and him being very, the men's and national champion. He's been doing this for a very long time, but you could just tell that his demeanor and his attitude was that, we're only a few events in. We are not looking to open the year strong and end it slowly or weak. You could tell that they were already getting ready for their hometown event in Salt Lake, and that even with that dominant of an event, the fact that they are kind of looking forward that much is quite a statement.
So what's yours? What's your one big takeaway? What are you going to give us?
I think for me, it's Pure, their run and their top 4 placement. I think we'll dive into it later as well, but just so impressed with what they were able to do to place within the top 4. I think this late in the game's life cycle, people had been talking about these players for a long time. They've been on a few different rosters. Last Shot has kind of been this player that's just become too good to ignore. And each event we've talked about him more and more. Also really impressed with his attitude. We got to talk to him after the event and just got a great head on his shoulders. Seems like a really humble dude who just loves to, as he said, just shoot his gun and do damage. And he definitely did that. So for me, I think it's a pretty special kind of Cinderella story for Pure, because I think when people think of competitive Halo these days, they might forget that this is an open bracket system. You know what I mean? The Halo has had Pro League eras that were closed, during Halo 5, and everyone kind of was missing the open bracket system. And I think Pure's run Granted, these have been top players for a long time. This is not straight up from the open bracket kind of story. But all I mean is that any given tournament, any given Sunday, a team can break in to a top 4 finish, and Pure proved that. And I think it's pretty special.
Yeah, it was a crazy run. I gotta say, it was good to have Druck back as well. I mean, for Druck to be pent up, waiting for his moment, get to the event and perform like that, I think was a really, really special moment for him as well. So shout out to Pure.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, next up, let's talk in detail about the SSG run because, man, not only was it another win, but it was unbelievably dominant. We should talk through their bracket, but as we do, is there anything that jumps out to you in terms of as we look through these matches and kind of their performance?
I mean, I look at their run, and some people might not even realize this, but they dropped one game in the champ bracket. That's nuts. Like, knowing how difficult it is now to win a series in Halo Infinite, to drop one game for the entirety of their champ bracket run is ridiculous. And I think the biggest thing for me was it was the way they went about the business, which was obviously like dominant, but it was the bounce back that was just so impressive because a lot of people were going, oh, SSG after London. Is this going to be a downward spiral? Is it going to be, the honeymoon period over? Are they going to struggle to get back to where they were? And it was honestly stupid to even suggest that with the talent that's on this team. But the fact that they won the event in the way that they won the event was really, really terrifying for me. And you kind of mentioned this earlier. They've now won 2 out of 3 of the events for the year. But on top of that, then the next event that's coming up is Salt Lake City, which is their hometown event, which they won last year, was their only win last year. And we know how heavy SSG based that crowd is going to be and the energy that gives to them as well. So we could well be looking at SSG winning 3 out of 4 of the events in the year, and then we have the World Championships. So that for me is kind of where my brain's at right now with the run, and what that's kind of led to my brain then equating it into. It was such a strong performance for me. One of the best of the year. It rivals FaZe, in my opinion, that we saw in London, that kind of run. It was just, it felt like no one was going to beat them at any point.
I feel the same way. And interestingly, they did drop. They dropped a few games in pools. They went 9-2 compared to the first 2 events of the year where they went 9-1. But I was particularly impressed because let's not forget they did drop game 1 to Quadrant, and I think you and I were talking about it. That there was potentially going to be a little bit of a mental hurdle there to lose game 1 3-2. It was Forbidden CTF to lose that 3-2 to Quadrant and have to maybe, look at being on the end of a reverse sweep again in bracket play. There was kind of these moments where you were like, oh no, is this about to happen again? But instead, they bounced back stronger than ever. It might be the strongest result we've seen in quite some time in terms of a tournament run. And as you say, they don't drop a game until the grand finals where they just drop. And once again, it's game 1. They lose game 1 to Optic in the grand finals, and then they roar back with 4 straight, which is just an absolutely remarkable set of games, amazing statistics from the entire team. And like you said, I think back-to-backing, if they do in Salt Lake, back-to-backing into world champs would be pretty remarkable. And I think the question for me now is, I think we know that SSG is undoubtedly capable of this. The rumors of their demise were greatly exaggerated. And the question for me is, do they even get fiercer from here? Do they even get more ruthless? Are they maybe not dropping those game 1s? That's kind of what I'm going to watch moving forward.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the scariest part of the performance for me was how I came away from the event and I wasn't like, oh my God, legend, wow, like he took over, or Stella, wow, he took over, or Ika. It was everyone. Like no player on that team had a bad game. It felt like everybody did their role. And we kind of discussed in the pre-show the teamwork, and on the show itself, we were talking a lot about bound statistics from London. It just felt like everything clicked. Like their teamwork was, that grand final, some of the times we were watching from Optic POV, it felt like it was 2v4 for like 5-6 minutes on the map. Like it was remarkable what they were able to do, and to do it so consistently against the best teams in the world. And you got to remember, even in the grand final as well, they came in against an Optic who were hot. Like Optic had made a crazy run. They were looking like that maybe it was their time to step up. Lucid's overkill is something obviously that's going to stand out in that run as well, but to shut them down and shut that momentum down in the way they did, SSG, all the props in the world to them. It was, I think, the scariest performance so far this year.
I think so too. And just to run people through kind of the scores of the games that they won, just in case you either didn't catch it or are forgetting the results. Solitude Slayer was 50-33, which is I think you might have an argument that people are going to call Solitude fairly snowbally, which is fine. Interference, Strongholds 250 to 152. Livefire King was close at 3-2. But Street Slayer was not, and that was the one that decided it, and it was 50-35 to close out the tournament. Huge margins from them. If you look at their other series as well, the margins were at times even stronger. Very few teams hitting. If you look at their last few matches, very few teams even hit 40 kills in the Slayers against them. For example, they kept Pure to 39 kills as well in a game 2 Slayer. So pretty wild, just results. But I think that tees us up well to talk about Optic placing second again and what that means for the team.
Yeah, what a weird place to be, right?
Yeah.
I mean, second place at every single event this year, but you never felt like they were going to win one, which is a really strange feeling. I felt at this event, maybe going into that final, I was like, okay, like I mentioned previously, they're on this hot run. It seems like Lucid's playing crazy Halo. Former was fired up every time that we went into a listening, which I loved. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, it's the same story again, isn't it? Like, they win that game 1, and then they just fell apart. Like, that final versus SSG, it almost felt like after they went down 2-1, it felt like Optic waved the white flag for me. Like, it never felt close, in my opinion. You mentioned that one game that was a 3-2, but even then, I felt like SSG a lot of the time were in control. And King of the Hill has always been a game type that I look at Optic and I'm like, this is your kind of game type. This is a control-based, game type where you can hold your angles. It's about doing damage and living, and that's what they do best. But the other games you look at in the series, it's not a performance where you can look at it and go, wow, okay, maybe next event, if they get to the final, they're going to win it.
Right.
Like, it's a worry for me. That's 2 finals now that Optic have lost to SSG. Neither of them felt close. The one in Arlington, I would say, felt closer, but still, it always felt like SSG were in control after they started their comeback there. And I just wonder if it's a mentality thing. I just wonder if it's they're just not as good. To put it very bluntly, like, are they good enough to consistently beat SSG and FaZe around them? It's an interesting one. I mean, you look at, they did play against FaZe at the tournament, and they did beat them. Mm-hmm. And it was a 3-1. The games were all close. It was a 4-3 to Optic Livefire. It was a 50-45 Aquarius, a 250 to 116 in the favor of Optic, and a 2-1 oddball to Optic to close it out. So very, very close. But then you have a 3-2 versus Pure, and Pure were on a hot run. They beat Shopify Rebellion 3-0. That doesn't count because Shopify don't know how to win games on Sundays. And then we get to the final. It's a 4-1. Like, I don't know what your like honest feeling is about Optic at the moment, because it's a very strange place and a very strange thing to talk about with a team who make the final every time. I mean, you look at SSG, right? Last year, made the final every time, but you felt like they were in those finals, that they had the opportunity to win it. And yeah, they came up short most of the time. But for Optic, it just felt like they've never felt like winning a final, even though they've been there every event this season.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's a strange place to be for this team. And also, I cannot remember throughout all of competitive Halo history where we've had a team consistently placing second while the victor is changing above them. You have different iterations of kind of straight TD, Carbon, FB, etc., where there was a 1-2 race where, say, FB was consistently beating Carbon until Carbon starts to win events back-to-back, and that was a clear 1-2 story. This, interestingly, is Optic seemingly being in second, but not only that, they continued to beat the team that has won the last event kind of at the wrong tournament. So if we think about Arlington, they beat FaZe twice, but SSG wins the event. If we look at London, they beat SSG, but FaZe wins the event. And now you go back to Atlanta, where they beat Optic again, and then they lose to SSG. So they're continually beating these same rosters that are then winning these events on and off. However, interestingly, when they match up in the grand final, they get the wrong flip of the coin, if you will, in terms of the matchup. And if you just simply swapped them in the bracket, you could argue that they'd be the tournament winners, which is really...
Do you think that, though? Like, do you think that, like, if they were to play at this event, FaZe in the final, that they would have played better? Because I just think the final, their performance in the bracket and pool play is so different to what we see in a final. And I don't know what it is.
I do in the case of Atlanta. And I also agree that what you're saying is, I think, worthy of conversation, because even though they have the results on paper, that doesn't necessarily mean they would win finals. But specifically within the Atlanta bracket, I think FaZe on home turf in a lower bracket quarterfinal would be playing with everything they had. And I think beating FaZe with those kind of stakes, because come on, FaZe, like, there was so much on the line there because they were going to place outside the top 4 if they lost, and they did. So, like, for me, I do think with the case of the Atlanta bracket, yes, they would have won in the grand final against FaZe. However, I still think your point stands that they are not playing good enough Halo to be winning these events overall.
Okay. It's a conundrum, I think, for Optic Gaming at the moment that they have to sort out.
It is, and and it's got to be. It's interesting because I think you and I have done the most chatting with Lucid on that squad, and this has got to be a head scratcher for them because they are getting results just in the wrong places in the brackets and in the wrong tournaments, and then in the grand finals they're not. So, for both Lunch and Lucid, kind of in the IGL coach roles, I am very curious. I mean, it still sets us up for a badass story of if they pull it off this year, it would be fucking incredible.
It would be a very Optic thing to do to win Worlds.
It would.
You know what I mean? Wouldn't that? Yeah. Now that you've planted that seed, I'm like, wait, this is building towards that. Yeah.
And I hope that that's where their head is at, because it's probably easy to get discouraged. Yeah. However, I'm hoping that they're and expecting them to be thinking big picture. So it still sets us up, but I think for an exciting next few events.
I agree. By the way, if you haven't seen the Lucid Overkill, shout out to Wes for his call on that, because it was nuts. Wow. Best overkill you've seen in Infinite? Question mark to you?
Yes, I think so. Especially because I talked to people, we were talking about this in the green room backstage during the event, but the fact that he was hitting bodies and then finishing arguably makes that even more difficult than other clips. So I agree. I think it's definitely my favorite over so far.
Okay, I would agree. Situational matchup, elevation differences, all that good stuff. Yeah. Incredible clip.
Yeah. Let's talk about FaZe. Did not expect us to come back here, because many of you listening will remember that the last episode was called "Why the Fuck Did We Doubt FaZe?" And then here
this one will be called "That's Why We Doubted FaZe." It's really it's wild to see FaZe placing outside of the top 4. I don't think anyone would have put them at a 5th, 6th finish, to say the very least. But yeah, let's talk about FaZe's run. Yeah, I mean, pool play was perfect. 9-0 for them. They had a pretty comfortable pool, I would say, comparatively to some of the other top seeds. But then they go into their upper bracket quarterfinal against Pure, and they get stomped 3-0. And I mean, I'm looking at the scores here. 2-1 Argyle, 50-48 Aquarius, 2 close games, but then they lose live fireball 2-0. Now, we know that Oddball has been somewhat of a weak point, a soft point for them historically, but they looked like they'd addressed that in London. But to lose an Argyle, which I always think is a strong FaZe game type with the snipers that they have on that team and the natural ability they have. The Aqua, I would say, for a Slayer is one that can go either way. We've seen it, huge comebacks. We've seen upsets for sure. But to lose 2-0 on the Oddball and lose, with all due respect to Pure, there's something that is not quite connecting for me in that series. And I remember seeing Snakebite after that series, and he was not a happy bunny, to say the least. It was like he was frustrated, because it felt like it was the same reasons that FaZe sometimes lose a series that were rearing their head again. Like, it felt like, was the intensity there? Was the teamwork there? Were too many players trying to win the game on their own? And almost this sense of overconfidence sometimes going into a series might have hurt them there. But to go down to the lower bracket, and then they beat Cloud9 3-0. That doesn't surprise me at all. They beat Sentinels 3-1, which is a good comeback. But then they lose 3-1 to Optic. So after their dominant performance in London, They were on top of the world, and then to come into your own event and perform like that is concerning to say the least. And we did a long interview with Frosty before the event got underway. He sat down with us at the event, up in the stands, and he was talking about complacency and how they don't feel like there's going to be an issue for them because they've been there before. I just think they just didn't play well. I know it's a really easy cop-out reason, but it just felt like they just didn't play good Halo, to their own standards throughout the event. And that's what happens, right? You play against good teams. We know that the chasing pack is desperate to prove themselves against this big 3 or 4 that we've been talking about all year long. And if you're not on your game in your first matchup in the upper bracket, this is what can happen now in Infinite. You can get 3-0'd. You can find yourself in lower bracket round 1 and going, okay, we have to win every single game. We have to win back-to-back series if we make it to a final to call ourselves champs again. And my worry for FaZe is, where does that leave them mentally ahead of the next event? Because I feel like that's a real tough loss to come back from.
Yeah, I agree. And you have to wonder, how many times can you use the kick in the pants of a disappointing finish as the ammo for the next one? Because they've already, on the one hand, they've done that and proved that that's possible. And to be honest, I would still bet on them pretty heavily showing up in a huge way in SLC. But you do wonder what kind of toll that takes if you think of these weeks of scrim results, and just needing to think, okay, somehow we let that happen again. I think that's just going to weigh on them. And maybe once again, these guys are professionals. Maybe they take that and they use it as ammo. But I think it's just surprising, as you say. I'm surprised to see them drop that first series against Pure. You have to think if they win that Slayer, even with the oddball loss, maybe they come back on 4 and 5. But that's, you can't look at tournaments and results that way. I think it's given them undoubtedly a lot to think about once again. And the question is, I think now it's in the first time they had to do this, coming out of Arlington into London. Let's not forget that was just 3rd, and we were already having the conversations about their placing. To now place 5th, 6th is a whole different conversation. And to be knocked essentially out of the top 4 by 2 of these teams, losing to Optic, who plays 2nd, and Pure, who plays 4th, kind of taking those spots from them, I think it's a whole different kind of conversation that they'll need to be having. And I think it changes from how do we bounce back to what adjustments do we make at a philosophical level? Because let's not forget, these are some of the best players in the world and could very well be world champions once again in a few months. But what kind of changes do they make at a philosophical, at a prep level, at a in-game intensity, in-game focus, tournament weekend focus? What kind of changes do they make is probably where the conversation goes. And I think the last thing I'll say is, I think a lot of credit to FaZe, because I believe it was Snakebite who said at the end of it, that you cannot take any breaks, and the margins in this game are so thin that if you don't show up in a series, your tournament run will be at great risk. So I think that is a really mature outlook on the result, and I think FaZe fans will hope that they bring that mentality into these next 2 tournaments.
Yeah, I agree. I think one stat that summarizes how disappointing this FaZe performance was. I think Maniac might have tweeted it out, actually. It was something along the lines of, it's the first time that Royal 2 and Snakebite have placed outside of the top 4 since 2010 or something like that. I can't remember the exact, might be a little bit later than that. I can't remember the exact date, but context aside, it's a long time, a long time, and something that they are not used to, not comfortable with, and we need to see a response in SLC, which is going to be a very tough place for them to respond. Because remember last time they were in SLC, FaZe, not a good performance. One of their weakest that we'd seen in a number of years. So they're going to have to figure it out, and they have to figure it out quick because we've only got 2 events left.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the good news for FaZe fans and for the FaZe players is I think they're going to rightly focus on what the World Championship story is. And I think they know better than anyone that as long as they come to Worlds, ideally SLC and Worlds if you're a FaZe fan, but as long as they show up at Worlds in the right way, and with the caliber of players there and their previous results, that means a win. And I think that they will have the right mentality in remembering that everyone will forget what happened at the Atlanta Major as long as they become world champions. And that's kind of the remedy. I think that's the prescription for how they solve this one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You want to move on to Pure?
Yes, let's talk about Pure.
We kind of mentioned FaZe, and they lost that series. I think it's only right.
I think so too. Yeah. So impressed with Pure this weekend. Just the entire roster, the way they approached this event. They kind of had, I think, what we were expecting from Pure. By the way, for those of you who didn't catch the event, Talik last shot, Druck and Cherished. Druck back on the scene. Last shot, I think, showing what he's capable of. Just this team was playing with nothing to lose, and man, did it ever show. It was fun to watch. You know, you're going up against the tournament favorite and the hometown team and the team that just won the last event, and you 3-0 FaZe. I mean, I think Talik said in our post-game interview it was the best series of his career, and what a time to do it.
Yeah. I mean, we had... The wonderful thing about pool play at the moment is we get an insight into what to expect, because we have so many good teams now in pools. And that series that they had in Pool B, Optic, obviously on the other side of it, the 3-2, the story coming out of that initially was, oh no, what's going wrong with Optic?
Right.
But then I think we all learned that it was, oh no, what's going right with Pure? Like, these guys are dangerous, like so dangerous. And I think a lot of the plaudits are going towards Last Shot, obviously, because he's kind of the newer face to the scene. Some of the numbers, the damage numbers, by the way, he was putting up were crazy, astronomical.
What was it
like tournament outliers?
5K more than any player on Optic in that series. What's the stat?
Yeah, it was ridiculous. Like, it was like, we looked at it and we were like, is that a numerical data driven error?
Yeah,
because it felt like it. But I also want to give a shout out to Cherished, because I think Cherished played some phenomenal Halo at points during big series. And when you're looking at statistics, you're always looking at, like we say, the damage outlier, the one who's putting up big KD. But some of the little clutch moments, like, for example, a live fire back green, managing to not just trade, but get 2 players to keep, timing on a rotate, whatever it might be. He was pulling off so many of those throughout the tournament. And I think he was a little bit of an unsung hero on this team. So, understandably, everyone deserves a shout out, right? Talik, I've always think is the most underrated player in the top 8. I think he is so smart in the way that he plays the game, and I think he's got a nasty shot. But every single member performed above and beyond, I think, expectations, and I think Cherished and Last Shot were the standouts for me on that team because of what they brought, because of their comparative experience to the teams they were playing against, and the clutch factor, which is something I feel like you have it or you don't. Like, it's one of those things you can't teach.
Absolutely. And it's even crazy too, because you mentioned the first series against Optic in pools. They played Optic again in the lower bracket and were 1 game away from the reverse sweep. So that just showed once again their resilience and just how hard they pushed Optic. And to be honest, I think just excited to see what this squad will do, because now it's not I think everyone was talking about, what will this team do, and will they be in the conversation? I think they firmly cemented themselves in the conversation. And now when you look at a bracket, it's no longer like, these guys could be a threat. It's like, that's the team that beat FaZe and took Optic to game 5 twice. And they are now, once again, as I said earlier, just too good to ignore.
I agree. And I think it also leads us on to our next point of discussion very nicely, because we're talking about Pure's run, how impressive they were into the top 4, pushing some of the best teams in the world. And then we need to talk about Shopify Rebellion.
Talk to me about what are your feels on Shopify? Because there's two parts of this conversation, as there have been the whole year.
Yeah, so I don't know. With Shopify Rebellion, I think someone needs to be in their ear and tell them that the tournament is played over 3 days, not just 2. Because to get to Sunday again, look great doing so. Yep. By the way, they beat Optic Gaming 3-1.
Yep.
After beating Quadrant 3-0 in the bracket. You look back at pool play as well, and pool play was great for them. They went 9-1 in pools, beat every single team. And remember, there was that Sentinel series that we were hyping up as maybe a top 4 decider in there as well. And they crunched Sentinels 3-1, and it looked very, very comfortable for them. To go into the same situation we've seen twice now this year. First event of the year, I'm like, okay, there's an excuse. It's your first time as a team putting in a big performance, making Sunday, making some noise. Second time around in London, I'm like, okay, now you didn't perform on the Sunday. It's a learning process. We know that Sunday is different. But now you've been there twice. I'm excited to see what you do in Atlanta. To go into Sunday and not win a single game, again, they lose to SSG 3-0 in the upper bracket final. Live Fire 250 to 170, Recharge 50-49, very, very close, and Solitude King was always felt like Space Station's game. And then to lose to Optic Gaming 3-0 and find yourself out of the tournament again. There is something not clicking. And I don't know what it is, because it's not quantifiable by looking in game. I think it's something. I don't know. It's a stage where we talk about clutch factor. We talk about playing when the lights are brightest. I worry that they are just one of those teams who on a Sunday find it a little bit too much.
Could be, yeah.
And
honestly, like
they need to figure that out.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting that, they're still putting up decent enough games. Like you said, a 50-49 Recharge maybe would have tied that series up with SSG in the upper bracket final. It's also a team that they had just in London 3-0'd, right? And obviously it was a different Space Station in London. But it's once again kind of, and then, a team that they had also, they had a really good performance. If you look at them beating Optic in the upper bracket semis in Atlanta as well, 3-1. So they're beating teams, and they're playing very well. And once again, it has to be said, top 3 again, 3rd place again for a team that a lot of people had not counted in the top 4 this season. So once again, it's still very impressive points on the board. I mean, think about even the prize money that they're taking home is, if you just look at Atlanta alone, right? It's like 4x the amount that FaZe took home. There's a lot to be proud of. But I agree, something needs to be looked at for the Sunday games, and I think it just needs to be a reminder of, hey, once again, it's not that dissimilar from the Optic story in that we've beat all the teams that we're losing to on Sunday, and you have to wonder if it's a routine thing, if it's a nerves thing. I'm curious as well, but I also think that the Shopify team is probably at a bit of a loss as well, because like you said, it doesn't add up. Looking at what they do across the first 2 days and then looking at the Sunday just doesn't add up. And it could be, granted, it is a different tier. When you're in that upper bracket final and the lower bracket final, that's a different level of team that they are matching up. But I stand by it. They lose to Space Station 3-0 and they just beat them in London. The same roster, not that long ago. I think Space Station looked the best they've ever looked, so there's a lot to be said there. But they need to be ready to play the best Halo they've ever played on those Sundays. And I think that's the kind of magic sauce, is what does that look like for them? How do they find the next tier of not just their gameplay, but ideally their career, by finding what they need to do to play the best Halo they've ever played on the Sundays? Not just winning games, but it's like, how do we become the best players we've ever been and show up at these next 2 events? Because let's not forget, like I said, they've beat these teams. They beat Optic. They beat Space Station this year. If they figure out the secret sauce for either SLC or Worlds, we could see them, and you've said it before too, we could see them easily in a grand final. You start to win games on Sundays, you find yourselves in a grand final. So yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity ahead of them. And if they finish this year top 3, it will still be a huge accomplishment. But I do think there is an unlocked tier for them that they could reach if they figure this out.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's, again, we've moved them. The good thing for them is we've moved the goalposts when we discussed this team from what we expected at the start of the year to what we're talking about now, right? And it's based off of a respect of the performance they've put in every event so far this year. But eyes are still on the Sunday scaries. They need to figure this out. It's, you say you got top 3 and you only lost to Optic and SSG. Understandable, but the fact that they're 3-0s, and I mean, what's their total map count on Sundays so far this year? Is it 1 game?
I'd have to look up the Arlington stats.
It could well be 1 game, if not 2, that they've won across 3 events on a Sunday. So it's certainly a reason for concern. But the good thing is, it's clear, right? It's not like, oh, we're just kind of muddling our way through brackets, just about scraping in. It's like they're making it every time Sunday, which is fantastic.
Right.
They just got to figure this last little piece of the puzzle out.
I think the lower bracket semi would have been on Sunday in Arlington, right? That was FaZe Shopify in the lower bracket. and that was 3-2. So they took FaZe all the way to a 50-44 game 5. And that would have been the series that they exited the tournament in. So 2 games on the board, and was definitely their best, outing to take FaZe to a game 5 in that way. So yeah, it's a lot to be looked at for the Sundays, and it could just be, if we look at, London and Arlington are just 2 events, and if you're on the Shopify side, maybe you're hoping, hey, those are just 2 bad, unlucky. You don't want your bad days on championship Sundays, but it is only 2 days of play, and like we said, big opportunity for them. Before we close, I'd love to talk about Europe, because interesting shakeups here, and you have ITB kind of re-entering the fold in a huge way, and even with a direct series up against Quadrant.
This was my favorite series of the event, because I love both these squads and what they've achieved. But it was almost like a redemption arc for ITB. I felt like London was. I was trying to think of like a polite phrase to use for this, but I'm gonna go with dog shit, because it was right. There's no excuse to go from top 6 to, was it top 16?
It was so low that I don't even know if we. Yeah.
Were they there?
They didn't make it out of
gym at some point.
didn't make it out of groups at essentially a on their home turf in terms of continent, if you will.
Yeah. And they have played against, elements of this team, Navi, whatever, historically have played against the French players, most of them of Quadrant, of course, over the years, and always come up short. If you watch the back end of after Worlds last year, there was a local LAN in Europe, Europa Halo Blackpool, that was decided in a 50-49 game 7. I think they had to change the amount of games played in that series, so it could have been a best of 5, could have been a best of 7. I don't remember off the top of my head, but they always come out on the bad side of it. Valencia as well. Remember, they beat them in bracket play and then lost in the finals. So it's always felt like Quadrant have had the upper hand over them. So it's not just, I think, the fact that they returned to form and got into the top 6. I think it's the fact that they got past a hurdle mentally to beat a team that they've wanted to beat and prove that they are good. They are should be considered as good and as much of a threat in the bracket to other teams as Quadrant have been over the last year and a half.
Right.
Great performance, top 6. On the flip side of that, Quadrant are going to be heartbroken, I think.
Yeah.
Because you remember what I was saying in the green room before this tournament got underway?
I do, even before the green room.
Yeah, no, I was
at the airport.
As soon as I was, anytime I was on Halo Day Live, they had a boot camp. Both teams did, of course, but Quadrant had a boot camp, and their series scores were insane against some of the best in the world. And granted, you've got to sprinkle the little bit of salt on top of it, or sugar. I don't know what the exact phrase is. But they are all sitting next to each other in a LAN center. There is an advantage of that.
I think you're looking for just 1 grain of salt, right?
One grain of. Yeah. I'm not. I'll Google it later. there's a saying in there somewhere. Basically, they had an advantage when it comes to those scrims, but it was the nature of the results. It was very, very strong against the best teams in the world, winning the most of those series. And I was like, you know what? Maybe this is where Quadrant click. And if Quadrant click at an event, they could make a final. Boy, was I wrong. We'll have to see how they bounce back, because I think for them, that is a real tournament to go back to the drawing board on. Yeah. Because I had such high expectations for them this event, and unfortunately, the team that takes it away from them, ironically, has been their biggest rivals in Europe. So it was an amazing story. That's another thing, by the way, I just want to quickly mention about Halo Infinite, how we have these crazy stories everywhere in the bracket.
Yeah.
It's one of the great things about watching these events. You're watching a match for top 6 in a lower bracket, and you're like, this one means more than a winner's semi-final. You know what I mean? It's wonderful. I love the fact that we're seeing Europe step up and create these stories in the bracket. So congratulations to ITB. It's good to see them back.
Me too. I think I think we've said it before in Infinite, but it continues to be the case, and you could argue now, especially with the heavy, violent alternating of FaZe SSG with Optic just trying to become part of the grand final in a meaningful way, plus Shopify and Pure shaking things up, and then the European story on top of that. I stand by it. We talked about how many years we've been doing this earlier in the show. In all that time, it's hard to think of a time that was more competitive within professional Halo, with just tons of money, tons of reputation on the line every single event as it all builds up to kind of the end of the year. I think it's just been really exciting, and these next two events could not be teed up better in terms of, it feels like every year when we get to the end of the year, there's way more questions than certainties.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that statement.
Just an awesome place to be. That sets us up well for the Salt Lake City pre-show, which will be coming soon. We're gonna, we'll cover that event in depth, of course, in the pre-show. But at the moment, we've got a little bit of a new meta and some GAs in play that we're gonna keep a close eye on.
Yeah, we certainly do. I'm always hesitant to give an opinion on them until I've seen them at the tournament. But in case you haven't caught what's going on essentially with the game at the moment, the Bandit rate of fire has been slowed down a little bit, which is interesting. It means that there's more escape routes. The time to kill is a little bit longer if you're just in a straight 1v1 Bandit engagement. There's also some GAs which have been coming in. No shotguns. And also the assault rifle, which has been tuned up, shall we say. Certainly been given a buff.
It's very diplomatic of you.
Maybe has been slightly overtuned. So the players have decided that they don't want to die from A-plat to tower on live fire by an assault rifle. So it's understandable.
Yeah, we'll keep a close eye on the GAs. As has been often been the case, if a GA exists during scrims this close to a tournament, there's a very good chance it will be in place for the event itself. We haven't had, compared to COD, like Halo, has not had that many GAs historically, but we will keep a close eye on that and see how it kind of goes over these next few weeks. Also excited to tell you that we have some inside scoops coming in the narrative pre-show in terms of what to expect in Salt Lake City. We are very lucky to get to spend some time with the SSG guys at events, and they've been giving us a little bit of a sneak peek and some previews of what's to come. So we're excited to bring those in the pre-show as well.
Tasty. It's going to be tasty. SLC is going to be amazing. And I know we say this about all events, but we both said last year that the Salt Lake event that SSG held it goes into our top 5 events of all time. And I think it still is there purely for the energy, the vibe, the crowd, just everything that makes SSG special was encapsulated in that event. And I can't wait to see them do it even bigger this time around. So super, super pumped for this event. And if you don't have tickets, go and get them because we want you to be there.
Yeah, make sure you snag them while they're still available. I couldn't agree more. Last year's SLC event, one of my favorites, the way it was just so SSG, the culture of it, the vibe, the way it was branded, everything felt so just special and like thoughtful. And that's kind of how SSG does things. And also, I think the FaZe Major was such a, like we talked about at the top of the show, such a success that it's kind of set a good bar for what can SSG do at an even bigger scale than last year. All of that and more is to come in the narrative pre-show. So we'll be back with that very, very soon ahead of the Salt Lake City Major. But we want to thank each and every one of you for listening to the show. We hope you've enjoyed the debrief. And we hope you'll join us for the Salt Lake City pre-show coming up, because we will be getting ready for that event very soon.
We will do indeed. And just a reminder to everybody, if you would be kind enough to hit subscribe if you're enjoying the content, it would be lovely, delightful, and you will have a special place in our hearts.
You will indeed. We can't thank you enough once again for listening. We'll be back soon with the narrative pre-show for Salt Lake City. We'll see you then.